Sometimes the cruelest enemies aren't strangers with swords, but neighbors who turn their backs when you need them most. A young mother holds her newborn twin daughters close, knowing that in her village their very existence marks her for death. The village council calls for her punishment. They beat her and leave her to die in the snow with her babies. But Erik Thorsson, an old Viking warrior who lives alone on the mountain, finds her at his door. He once lost his own family and turned away from the world. Now he must choose. He can save 3 innocent lives or let tradition destroy them. His decision will change everything, but one question remains. Can a warrior who once conquered foreign lands find the courage to battle the darkness in his own home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The blood-stained, swaddling cloth lay crumpled in the snow beside Erik Thorsson's oak door, a testament to how close death had come calling. Inside his stone fortress, built with hands that had once wielded axes in foreign lands, the Viking warrior knelt beside a makeshift bed where a young woman fought for every breath. Her name was Astrid, though he'd learned that only after hours of fevered whispers. The twin girls, no bigger than his weathered fists, lay wrapped in his own woolen cloak, their tiny lungs working like bellows as they took their first tastes of a world that had already rejected them. Erik's battle-worn axe hung on the wall above them, its iron edge dulled by decades of use and years of neglect. He'd carried that weapon through the fjords of Norway, across the North Sea to Saxon shores, and into battles whose names had become legend around winter fires. Now it watched over 3 souls whose only crime was existing. The fortress had been built for war, each stone placed with the precision of a man who understood that survival depended on preparation. High walls, narrow windows, and a commanding view of the valley below, where his former neighbors went about their lives in ignorance of the drama unfolding above them. For 15 years, this had been Erik's sanctuary from a world that had taken everything he loved. The plague had come through their village, like a scythe through wheat, cutting down young and old alike. His wife Sigrid had been the first to fall, her laughter silenced in a matter of days. Their son Magnus, not yet 10 winters old, had followed her to Valhalla within the week. Erik had buried them himself on the hillside behind his home, marking their graves with stones carved by his own trembling hands. After that, the village had become a place of ghosts. Every street corner held memories of Sigrid's smile, every doorway echoed with Magnus's boyish laughter. So Erik had climbed to his mountain fortress and pulled the world closed around him like a burial shroud. The villagers below had eventually stopped coming to check on him, stopped sending invitations to their feasts and ceremonies. He'd become the hermit of the mountain, the broken warrior who'd chosen solitude over healing. But now, as he watched Astrid's chest rise and fall with each labored breath, something stirred in his heart that he'd thought dead and buried. Her face, though pale and bruised from the beating, held a strength that reminded him of Sigrid in her fierce moments. The way she'd reached for her daughters even as consciousness slipped away, the protective curve of her body shielding them from the cold. It spoke of a love that transcended pain. The village below held different memories for Astrid. She'd arrived 3 years ago, a young bride brought north by Björn the trader to wed and start a new life far from whatever troubles had driven her from her birthplace. Björn had been a good man, kind and patient, building her a small home near the market square, where she could sell her fine needlework and herb remedies. Their marriage had been one of quiet contentment rather than passionate love, but it had promised stability and children and a place to belong. When Björn died in a trading accident the previous winter, thrown from his horse during a blizzard and found frozen the next morning, Astrid had been left alone with nothing but a modest house and the child growing in her belly. The pregnancy had been difficult from the start. The village women whispered that a child conceived in grief would bring sorrow, but Astrid had clung to the hope that Björn's child would bring light back to her world. When the midwife announced twins during that terrible night of labor, the whispers had turned to open accusations. Twin girls born to a widow were seen as Loki's joke, a cosmic mockery of natural order. The old women spoke of ancient curses, of children born under dark stars who would bring misfortune to any community foolish enough to shelter them. Even worse, some claimed that only infidelity could produce twins, that Astrid had betrayed her dead husband's memory with another man's seed. Jarl Gunnar, the village leader, had listened to these whispers with the cold calculation of a man who valued order above all else. His rule was built on tradition and fear, on the belief that harsh justice prevented greater catastrophes. When the village council convened at dawn after the twins' birth, their verdict had been swift and merciless: exile and death. The beating had been carried out in the town square as the sun rose, each blow delivered with righteous conviction by men who believed they were protecting their community from divine wrath. Astrid had tried to shield her newborn daughters, but hands pulled them away as fists and clubs fell on her shoulders and back. Only when she'd stopped moving did they wrap the babies in rough cloth and place them beside her broken body. "Let the mountain wolves finish what we've started," Gunnar had declared. "The gods will know we've done our duty." But the gods, it seemed, had other plans. Erik had found them at his doorstep as the morning mist rolled up from the valley, drawn by the sound of infant cries that carried on the thin mountain air. At first, he'd thought it another hallucination. Grief had played cruel tricks on his mind before, conjuring the phantom sounds of Magnus calling for his father in the dark. But the cries persisted, and when he'd opened his door, reality crashed over him like a cold wave. Now, as he spooned warm broth between Astrid's cracked lips, Erik felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crack. The twins, Freydis and Ingrid, as their mother had named them in her delirium, slept peacefully in the wooden box he'd fashioned as a temporary cradle. Their breathing was steady now, their tiny faces relaxed in the way that only the truly innocent could manage. Outside, his window, the valley spread below like a map of his former life. He could see the village market square where he'd once walked hand in hand with Sigrid, the harbour where Magnus had loved to watch the fishing boats return with their catch. Somewhere down there, Jarl Gunnar sat in his hall, satisfied that justice had been served and order maintained, but Erik Thorsson had seen enough of the world to know that true justice was rarer than gold and infinitely more precious. He'd witnessed kings who called themselves just while they slaughtered peasants for sport, and he'd known simple farmers who'd shared their last crust of bread with strangers. Justice wasn't found in tradition or law. It lived in the choices people made when no one was watching, when doing right meant risking everything. As the sun reached its zenith and painted his stone walls with warm light, Erik made his choice. He would protect them, not because of some grand principle or divine calling, but because in their faces he saw the possibility of redemption, not just for them, but for himself. The first sign of trouble came with the afternoon shadows. Erik spotted them from his watchpost on the eastern wall. 3 figures climbing the mountain path, their purposeful stride and familiar silhouettes telling him everything he needed to know. The village had sent scouts to confirm what they suspected, to see if the hermit warrior had really taken in their condemned outcasts. Erik touched the handle of his axe, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon that had served him through countless battles. But this wasn't a fight he could win with strength of arms alone. This was a battle for souls, for the right to choose mercy over tradition, love over fear. Astrid stirred in her makeshift bed, her eyes fluttering open to focus on his weathered face. For the first time since he'd found her, she seemed truly aware of where she was and who had saved her. "My daughters," she whispered, her voice raw from crying. "Safe." Erik replied, gesturing to where the twins slept peacefully. "You're all safe now." Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow this time, but of gratitude so profound it seemed to fill the stone chamber with warmth. She tried to speak, but Erik placed a gentle finger to her lips. "Rest," he said. "There'll be time for words later. Right now, you need to heal." But even as he spoke those comforting words, Erik's eyes were drawn to the window and the three figures still climbing. Toward his door. The village would come for them soon, and when they did, he would have to decide not just whether to fight, but whether he was willing to step back into a world that had caused him so much pain. The twins stirred in their makeshift cradle, their tiny fists pushing against the woolen swaddling. In their movements, Erik saw not the cursed omens the village claimed to fear, but simply two children who deserved the chance to grow up in a world where love mattered more than superstition. The afternoon wore on, and the scouts completed their reconnaissance. Erik Thorsson prepared for war. Not the kind of war he'd fought in foreign lands for gold and glory, but the kind that mattered most. A war for the right to choose compassion over cruelty, hope over tradition, and love over fear. The village council's judgment staff struck the stone threshold of Erik's fortress with 3 ceremonial blows, each impact echoing through the mountain air like thunder. Jarl Gunnar stood behind his messenger, flanked by 6 armed men whose hands rested casually on their sword hilts. The message was clear. This was not a request. Erik Thorsson called Hakon the law speaker, his voice carrying the weight of official decree. "By order of the village council, and in the name of our sacred traditions, you will surrender the cursed woman and her spawn to face the judgment of the gods." Erik emerged from his doorway slowly, his massive frame filling the entrance as he studied the delegation. Gunnar looked older than when Erik had last seen him at Björn's funeral. New lines creased his face, and his beard had gone completely grey. But his eyes still held that cold calculation that had made him a successful leader and a dangerous enemy. "The woman is under my protection," Erik said simply. His voice carried across the space between them with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "As are her children." Gunnar stepped forward, his jaw working as if he were chewing tough meat. "This is not your concern, old friend. The council has spoken. The woman violated our sacred laws, and her cursed offspring threatened the spiritual safety of our community. Stand aside." "No." The single word hung in the air like a blade suspended over their heads. Behind Erik, he could hear Astrid stirring, could sense her terror as she recognized the voices of her tormentors. The twins remained mercifully quiet, as if some infant instinct warned them that silence might mean survival. "You forget yourself, Erik," Gunnar continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You withdrew from our community 15 years ago. You have no standing to interfere with our justice." "Justice?" Erik's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You call beating a grieving mother and condemning newborn children to death justice. I've seen more honor among the wolves that hunt these mountains." One of Gunnar's men, Erik recognized him as Thorvald, the blacksmith's son, spat in the snow. "Those are demon spawn, old man. Everyone knows twins born to unwed mothers bring curses on the land. The crops failed in Skana after they let similar abominations live." "Astrid was wed to Björn the trader," Erik replied evenly. "You attended the ceremony yourself, Thorvald. Your memory seems as weak as your courage." Thorvald's hand moved to his sword, but Gunnar's raised palm stopped him. The Jarl understood that Erik Thorsson, even at 50 winters and 15 years, removed from active warfare, remained a formidable opponent. More importantly, he understood that this confrontation was about more than one woman and her children. It was about authority, tradition, and the very foundation of their social order. The woman was with child when her husband died, Gunnar said carefully. The timing suggests infidelity, and the birth of twins to such a woman can only be seen as divine punishment for her adultery. You're calling a grieving widow a whore based on village gossip, Erik replied, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet tone his enemies had learned to fear. How far you've fallen, Gunnar. Your father would be ashamed. The insult struck home. Gunnar's father had been a great leader, known for his wisdom and fair judgment. To suggest that the son had dishonored that legacy was perhaps the cruelest blow Erik could have delivered. Careful, hermit, Gunnar snarled. Your reputation won't protect you if you persist in this foolishness. The woman and her spawn will die, if not by our hands, then by starvation, when we cut off all trade and support to this mountain. You cannot feed them all winter on pride alone. I've survived 15 winters without your support, Erik replied. I can manage a few more. Behind him, a soft cry from one of the twins broke the tension. The sound, innocent and utterly human, seemed to cut through the posturing and political maneuvering like a sword through silk. For a moment, even Gunnar's hard expression softened slightly as some paternal instinct responded to the universal language of a crying child, but the moment passed quickly and his face hardened again. 3 days, he announced. You have 3 days to come to your senses and surrender them. After that, you'll be declared outlaw and enemy of the community. Any who aid you will share your fate. And if I refuse? Gunnar's smile was cold as mountain. Ice. Then you'll discover that your legendary skills have grown rusty with age and isolation. The world has moved on, Erik. New warriors have risen, hungrier and less burdened by outdated concepts of honor. With that threat hanging in the air, Gunnar turned and began the descent back to the village, his men following in formation. But Egon the law speaker lingered for a moment, his weathered face showing the conflict of a man caught between duty and conscience. Don't do this, Erik, he said quietly. I knew your father. He was a good man who understood that sometimes we must make hard choices for the greater good. Don't let your grief cloud your judgment. My grief opened my eyes, Erik replied. When you lose everything, you learn what truly matters. These children matter, their mother matters. That's something your Jarl has forgotten in his pursuit of power. Hakon shook his head sadly and hurried after his companions, leaving Erik alone on his threshold with nothing but the wind and the weight of his decision for company. Inside the fortress, Astrid had managed to pull herself upright, though the effort clearly cost her. Her face was pale with pain and fear, but her eyes blazed with a desperate hope that broke Erik's heart. You shouldn't have done that, she whispered. They'll kill you for defying them, kill all of us. Erik knelt beside her makeshift bed, his large hands gentle as he helped her lie back down. They might try, he admitted, but I've been running from life for 15 years, hiding in these mountains while the world turned without me. Maybe it's time I stood for something worth fighting. But why? Astrid's voice was barely audible. You don't know me. You owe me nothing. Why risk everything for strangers? Erik was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving to the twins who had settled back into peaceful sleep. Because, he said finally, when I found you at my door, bleeding and broken with these innocents in your arms, I saw something I thought I'd lost forever. I saw hope, and hope is worth any risk. Astrid's tears came then, not the bitter tears of despair she'd shed during her beating, but the cleansing tears of someone who'd found an unexpected ally in the darkest hour. I don't even know how to thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. Erik replied grimly, we have 3 days to prepare for war, and make no mistake, that's exactly what's coming. Gunnar won't let this challenge to his authority stand. He'll return with more men, and when he does, we'll need to be ready. As if summoned by his words, one of the twins, little Freydis, opened her eyes and looked directly at Erik with the solemn gaze that newborns sometimes possess. In that moment he felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight bands of grief and isolation that had bound his heart for so long. "I claim them as my daughters," he said quietly, the words carrying the weight of a sacred oath. "All three of you. Whatever comes next, you're family now." Outside, the mountain wind carried the sound of voices from the valley below as gunners. Delegations spread word of the hermit's defiance. By nightfall, the entire village would know that Erik Thorsson had chosen to stand against tradition and authority in defense of 3 lives the community had condemned. The battle lines were drawn. In 3 days, Erik would discover whether his legendary skills were indeed rusty with age and isolation, or whether some wars were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Astrid's wedding ring caught the firelight as she slowly lifted a wooden spoon to her lips, the simple gold band hidden beneath layers of bandages and dried blood. She'd kept it concealed during the village trial, knowing that revealing her true identity would only complicate an already deadly situation. Now, in the safety of Erik's stone hall, the ring felt like a weight, both anchor and burden. "You need to eat more," Erik said gently, settling beside her with his own bowl of thick barley stew. The meal had become their evening ritual over the past 3 days, these quiet moments when the twins slept and they could speak without fear of being overheard. "I'm trying," Astrid replied, managing another spoonful. Her appetite was slowly returning as her body healed, but each bite reminded her of how close death had come. "Erik, there are things about me you don't know. Things that might change how you feel about protecting us." Erik studied her face in the flickering light. "Whatever secrets you carry, they don't change what I saw at my door. A mother protecting her children with her last breath. That's all I need to know." But Astrid shook her head. "You deserve the truth. My real name is Astrid Eriksdottir, daughter of Jarl Erik the Red of Kjalarnes. My marriage to Björn wasn't just about love. It was a political alliance between our territories. The revelation hung between them like smoke from the fire." Erik's expression remained steady, but Astrid caught the slight tightening around his eyes that spoke of understanding dawning. "Gunnar knows this," Erik said. "It wasn't a question. I believe so. Björn died too conveniently during a storm where any number of accidents could explain a thrown horse and a broken neck. And condemning me as an adulteress conveniently eliminates any claim my children might have to their grandfather's lands." Erik set down his bowl and moved to the window that overlooked the village. Far below, torchlight flickered in Gunnar's Hall, where men gathered for what looked like more than casual evening conversation. "This changes things," he said finally. "I know. If you want to reconsider—" "No." Erik's voice was firm. "It changes the scope of what we're fighting, but not why we're fighting. Those children deserve to live regardless of what political games adults play around them." A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Erik's hand moved instinctively to his axe handle, but the knock came again. 3 short taps, followed by 2 long ones, a code Erik hadn't heard in years. "Stay back," he murmured to Astrid, then called out, "Who seeks shelter from the mountain cold?" "An old friend who brings gifts from below," came the reply. Erik smiled grimly and unbarred the door. Olaf the blacksmith stood in the threshold, his massive frame silhouetted against the star-filled sky. His arms were loaded with packages wrapped in oiled leather. "Olaf, you old fool," Erik said, stepping aside to let the giant man enter. "What brings you up the mountain at this hour?" "Conscience, mostly," Olaf replied, setting his bundles on Erik's table. "Also curiosity about whether the great Erik Thorsson has finally lost his mind completely." Olaf's presence filled the chamber with warmth and familiarity. He'd been Erik's closest friend in the old days, the one man who'd continued to visit, even after the plague took Erik's family. His loyalty was legendary, matched only by his skill at the forge and his ability to drink most men under the table. "What did you bring?" Erik asked, though he suspected he already knew. Practical things, Olaf replied, unwrapping a bundle to reveal several small blades, perfectly balanced and sharp as winter wind. Teaching knives in case the lady needs to learn some practical skills. Also some proper swaddling cloth for the little ones and enough dried meat to last a month if rationed properly. Astrid struggled to her feet, swaying slightly with the effort. Master Olaf, I remember you from the market. You were always kind when I came to your shop. Kindness had nothing to do with it, lady. You paid fairly and never haggled like some. Olaf's gruff exterior softened as he looked at the twins sleeping peacefully in their makeshift cradle. Besides, any fool can see these are just babies, not the demons Gunnar claims them to be. How many in the village share that view? Erik asked. Olaf scratched his bearded chin thoughtfully. More than Gunnar realizes, but fewer than we need. The women especially are troubled by what happened. Several came to my shop asking pointed questions about the difference between justice and cruelty. And the men split, mostly along lines you'd expect. The younger ones follow Gunnar out of ambition or fear. The older ones remember when leadership meant protecting the weak, not sacrificing them to maintain order. Olaf began unwrapping another bundle, which brings me to the real reason for my visit. Inside the leather wrapping lay a small horn, carved from yellowed ivory and decorated with intricate knots. Erik recognized it immediately, the warning horn that had once belonged to his father. You kept it, Erik said softly. Figured you might need it again someday. And if not you, then someone worthy of carrying on your father's legacy. Olaf's eyes moved meaningfully to where Astrid stood. There are those in the village who remember what real leadership looks like. When the time comes to choose sides, that horn might help them remember which side honors the old ways. Before Erik could respond, a child's cry broke the peaceful atmosphere. Little Ingrid had awakened and was demanding attention with the imperious wail that only newborns can produce. Without thinking, Astrid moved to comfort her daughter, her maternal instincts overriding her physical weakness. Erik watched as she lifted the baby with practiced ease, her voice dropping to the soft croon. That seemed to calm even the most fractious infant. The sight stirred something deep in his chest. Memories of Sigrid with their son, the gentle domesticity he'd thought lost forever. You have children of your own? Astrid asked Olaf, as she settled with Ingrid against her shoulder. 3 sons, all grown and working their own forges now, and 5 grandchildren who would skin me alive if they knew their grandfather had turned his back on babies in need. Olaf's expression grew serious. Which is why I need you to understand. What you're asking Erik to do, it's not just defying Gunnar. It's declaring war on the entire power structure of our community. I'm not asking him to do anything, Astrid replied quietly. He made this choice himself, against my arguments. Erik moved to stand beside her, his presence both protective and supportive. I'm done hiding from the world, Olaf. These children deserve better than a community ruled by fear and superstition. If standing up to Gunnar means war, then so be it. Olaf studied his old friend's face for a long moment, then nodded, slowly. In that case, you'll need to start thinking like a commander again, not a hermit. Gunnar's bringing in mercenaries from the coast, men who don't care about village politics or the righteousness of your cause. They care about silver, and Gunnar has plenty of that. How many? 6, maybe 8. Hard fighters who've been turned away from more respectable work. Olaf began wrapping up his empty bundles. But here's the thing about mercenaries. They expect easy victories and quick payment. Draw this out, make them work for their silver, and they might reconsider their contract. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of hoofbeats echoed up from the valley. All 3 adults froze, listening to the rhythmic clip-clop that spoke of riders moving at speed through the darkness. Too early for them to be coming up here, Olaf murmured, moving to the window, but late enough for them to be positioning themselves. Tomorrow will bring the real test, I think. Erik felt the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded battle. Not fear, but the sharp focus that came with accepting that violence was inevitable. He'd felt it countless times before, charging shield walls or storming fortified positions. Now he felt it while holding a baby's cradle in one hand and a teaching knife in the other. The old warrior and the new father were about to become the same man again. The twin wooden cradles took shape under Erik's careful hands like prayers carved. In oak, he worked by firelight in the pre-dawn hours, while Astrid and her daughters slept, each cut of his knife guided by memories of another cradle he'd made decades ago for a son who would never grow old enough to outgrow it. "You're putting too much love into those," Astrid said softly from behind him. Erik didn't turn around, but his hands stilled on the wood. "My son Magnus would have been 25 this winter. When he was born, I spent 3 days carving his cradle, determined to make something that would last generations." His voice grew thick. "I thought I was building for the future. Instead, I was creating a memorial." Astrid moved closer, her recovery allowing her to walk without pain now. "These cradles will hold living children, Erik. Your love isn't wasted. It's invested." The simple wisdom of her words settled over him like a warm cloak. Erik resumed his carving, adding small protective runes along the edges. Not because he believed in their power, but because hope needed symbols to make itself real. Soft scratching at the door interrupted their quiet moment, too gentle for an attack, too purposeful for an animal. Erik set down his knife and moved to the window, peering out at the grey morning light that was just beginning to paint the mountainside. A young man in priest's robes stood outside, his nervous fidgeting betraying his anxiety. Erik recognized Magnus the Younger, named for Erik's own son and ordained just 2 years ago as the village's spiritual guide. The irony of the name wasn't lost on either man. "Father Magnus," Erik said as he opened the door, "you're either very brave or very foolish to be here." "Probably both," the young priest admitted, stepping inside gratefully. "But I couldn't sleep knowing there were souls up here in need of comfort and guidance." Magnus was perhaps 25, with the earnest face of someone who'd entered the priesthood out of genuine calling rather than political ambition. His presence filled the stone chamber with nervous energy as he took in the domestic scene, Erik's woodworking, Astrid tending her daughters, the sense of family that had grown between them. "You've caused quite a stir in the village," Magnus said, accepting a cup of warm ale from Astrid. "Half the people are calling you a fool, and the other half are calling you a hero." "And which half is right?" Erik asked. "Both, I think. Foolish to take on the entire village council for strangers, heroic to risk everything for innocent lives." Magnus moved to where the twins lay sleeping. "May I?" Astrid nodded, and the young priest gently lifted little Fridas, cradling her with the practiced ease of someone who'd blessed many children. "I baptized dozens of babies this past year," he said softly. "Never once did I see evidence of demonic possession or divine curse. Just children who needed love and protection." "Will you marry us?" Astrid asked suddenly. Both men turned to stare at her. She'd spoken quietly, but with the firm resolve of someone who'd made an important decision. "Astrid," Erik began, but she held up her hand. "No, listen. If we're going to face this together, if you're truly claiming my daughters as yours, then we should be bound properly, not for politics or protection, but because—" She paused, her cheeks coloring slightly. "Because in these past few days you've shown me more kindness and respect than I knew existed in the world." Erik felt something shift in his chest, like ice breaking up in spring rivers. "And you've brought life back to a house that had forgotten what laughter sounded like." Magnus looked between them, his young face serious. "Marriage is sacred, not Just a legal arrangement. Are you both certain this is what your hearts want, not just what circumstances demand? My heart died with Sigrid, Erik said quietly. But something new is growing in its place, something that includes all of you. Astrid's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I loved Björn, but it was the comfortable love of arrangement and respect. What I feel for Erik, it's deeper, fiercer, worth fighting for. Magnus set Freydis back in her makeshift cradle and moved to his travelling pack, withdrawing a small leather-bound book. Then by the power vested in me by God and the Church, and witnessed by these innocent souls who brought you together, I'll perform the ceremony. The wedding was unlike any Erik had ever attended. No feast hall filled with guests, no elaborate dresses or ceremonial weapons, just a young priest, a recovering mother, a grizzled warrior, and 2 sleeping babies as witnesses. But as Magnus spoke the ancient words and Erik and Astrid exchanged simple vows, the stone chamber filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. When it was done, Magnus made the sign of the cross over the twins and spoke a blessing over the new family. May God protect this household and grant you strength for the trials ahead. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed up the mountain path. Many horses, moving at a steady but unhurried pace. Erik moved to the window and counted at least 12 riders, their armor and weapons glinting in the morning sun. Gunners kept his word about the 3-day deadline, Erik observed grimly. Though he's brought more friends than expected. Magnus peered over Erik's shoulder and paled. Those aren't all village men. I recognize some of them, mercenaries who've been drinking in our taverns for the past week. He turned to Astrid with concern. My lady, perhaps you should take the children to the back chamber. No, Astrid replied firmly, moving to stand beside Erik at the window. If this is our fight, then I'll face it beside my husband. The word husband sent a warm surge through Erik's chest, even as he calculated odds and defensive positions. 12 armed men against 2 adults and a young priest with newborn babies to protect. In his prime, with a full war party behind him, these might have been acceptable odds. Now, but there's another way, Magnus said suddenly. The Church has laws about sanctuary. If I formally claim this household under divine protection, Gunnar doesn't respect Church law when it conflicts with his authority, Erik replied. And I won't hide behind your robes when my family is threatened. Your family, Astrid repeated softly, testing the words. Then, with growing strength, our family. Outside, the riders had reached the base of Erik's mountain path. Gunnar sat his horse at the front of the group, his steel helm glinting in the pale sunlight. Beside him rode men Erik didn't recognize, hard-faced warriors with the casual violence of professionals about them. Erik Thorsson, Gunnar's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air, your time of grace has ended. Surrender the woman and her spawn, or face the consequences of your defiance. Erik picked up his battle-axe from where it leaned against. The wall, its familiar weight settling into his hands like an old friend returning home. Magnus, I need you to take Astrid and the children to the back chamber. There's a hidden passage that leads to caves deeper in the mountain. I'm not leaving you to face them alone, Astrid protested. You're not leaving me, Erik replied, his voice gentle but firm. You're protecting our daughters. That's the most important job either of us can do right now. Magnus gathered the twins, while Astrid reluctantly moved toward the rear of the chamber, but before disappearing into the shadows, she turned back to Erik with fierce determination in her eyes. You come back to us, she said. We've just found each other. I won't lose you to Gunnar's pride. Erik nodded, then stepped outside to face the armed delegation. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of snow from the higher peaks. A good day to be alive, he thought. A good day to fight for something that mattered. Gunnar, he called down to the assembled riders, I see you've brought friends. Afraid to face an old hermit by yourself? One of the mercenaries, A scarred man with the build of a professional soldier spat in the snow. "This is the legendary Erik Thorsson. Looks more like a broken-down farmer to me." Erik smiled coldly. "Come up and find out," but Gunnar held up a restraining hand. "There's no need for bloodshed, old friend. Simply hand over the woman and her cursed offspring, and you can return to your isolation in peace." "The woman is my wife," Erik replied, his voice carrying clearly across the mountainside. "The children are my daughters. You'll have to kill me to take them." A murmur ran through the assembled riders. Even the mercenaries seemed taken aback by the simple declarative statement. Marriage changed everything. It made this not just about village law, but about a man's right to protect his own family. "Your wife?" Gunnar's voice rose with incredulous anger. "You married a condemned adulteress, a woman who bore cursed twins." "I married a widow who needed protection and children who deserved better than your version of justice," Erik replied. "And I'd make the same choice 100 times over." The standoff stretched for long moments, each side taking the measure of the other. Then one of the mercenaries, younger than the others and clearly eager to prove himself, spurred his horse. "Forward! Enough talk!" he shouted. The old man's had his chance to surrender. The young mercenary's charge up the narrow mountain path was brave but foolish. Erik had chosen his fortress well. The approach was steep and narrow, forcing attackers to come at him single file. As the rider reached the level ground before Erik's door, his horse stumbling slightly on the rocky terrain, Erik moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent decades perfecting the art of violence. The mercenary's sword was still clearing, its sheath when Erik's axe took him across the chest, the impact lifting him from his saddle and sending him tumbling down the mountainside. His horse, riderless and panicked, bolted back toward the village. The silence that followed was deafening. The remaining mercenaries stared up at Erik with new respect and wariness. This wasn't the broken hermit they'd expected to intimidate. This was the legendary warrior their contracts had mentioned only in passing. "Anyone else eager to test themselves?" Erik called down to them. Gunnar's face had gone pale with rage. "You've just signed your death warrant, Erik. That man was under my protection." "That man attacked my home and threatened my family," Erik replied. "He got exactly what he deserved." The Jarl wheeled his horse around, addressing his remaining men. "Surround the mountain. Nothing goes up or down without my permission. We'll starve them out if we have to." As the riders spread out to establish their siege positions, Erik retreated into his fortress and barred the door. In the back chamber, he found Astrid nursing one of the twins, while Magnus kept watch at a narrow window that overlooked the rear approach to the mountain. "How bad is it?" Astrid asked without looking up. "We bought ourselves some time," Erik replied. "They'll try to starve us out before risking another direct assault." "How much time?" Erik considered their supplies. The dried meat Olaf had brought, the grain stores he maintained, the fresh water from his well. "A month, maybe longer if we're careful." Magnus turned from his window post. "That might be enough. Word of what's happening here is spreading through the village. Some of the women have been asking pointed questions about the difference between justice and murder, and the men divided. The older ones remember your father's leadership. They know the difference between strength and brutality, but the younger ones see only Gunnar's authority and their own ambitions. Outside, they could hear the mercenaries calling to each other as they established their siege lines. Professional soldiers, Erik noted, but not particularly imaginative ones. They were setting up a conventional siege as if this were a coastal raid against a Saxon stronghold. "They're making a mistake," he murmured. "What kind of mistake?" Astrid asked. Erik moved to the window and studied the tactical situation developing below. "They're thinking like raiders attacking a fortress. But this isn't a fortress, it's a home. And I'm not defending territory, I'm protecting family." As if to emphasize his point, little Ingrid chose that moment to wake up and demand attention with a healthy wail. The sound echoed through the stone chamber, transforming the military crisis into something more immediate and human. Erik found himself smiling as he watched Astrid comfort their daughter. Whatever happened in the days ahead, they'd already won. Something precious. They'd become a family, and families, Erik knew, fought differently than armies. They fought with everything they had, because they had everything to lose. The ancient rune stone that marked Erik's family burial ground had been cracked by winter frost and neglect, its carved symbols weathered to barely visible scratches in the grey granite. Astrid knelt beside it in the pale morning light, her fingers tracing the damaged letters, while Erik mixed mortar from clay and crushed stone. "What does it say?" she asked softly. "Here rest Sigrid the Wise and Magnus the Beloved, untaken by plague, but not forgotten by those who loved them," Erik replied, settling beside her with his tools. "I carved it the day after I buried my son. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the chisel." 3 days had passed since Gunnar's deadline expired, and the siege began. The mercenaries had settled into their positions with professional efficiency, content to wait while their employers' silver lasted. But something had changed in the valley below. Smoke rose from more cooking fires than usual, and the sound of voices carried on the wind with an urgency that spoke of community meetings and heated discussions. "We could repair it together," Astrid suggested, running her palm over the cracked surface. "Add space for new names when the time comes. Make it a monument to hope instead of loss." Erik looked at his wife with wonder. Even surrounded by armed enemies and facing uncertain death, she thought in terms of future generations and lasting legacy. It was a kind of courage he'd rarely encountered, even among seasoned warriors. "The Jarl has declared you outlaw," Magnus reported, returning from his morning reconnaissance. The young priest had proven surprisingly skilled at moving unseen through the mountain paths, gathering intelligence from his conversations with villagers who still climbed to higher ground for prayer or meditation. "I assumed as much when his deadline passed," Erik replied, not looking up from his work mixing mortar. "What's the mood in the village?" Divided and growing more so each day. Ragnhild the Weaver gathered a group of women at her house yesterday. They're calling it a sewing circle, but everyone knows it's really about discussing what's happening up here. Astrid smiled grimly. "Never underestimate the power of women with needles and strong opinions." "What are they saying?" "That beating a new mother and condemning babies to death crosses a line that shouldn't be crossed, regardless of tradition or superstition." Ragnhild lost her own child to sickness last winter. She knows the difference between divine judgment and human cruelty. A distant horn call echoed across the valley, followed by the sound of many voices raised in what might have been celebration or alarm. All 3 adults froze, listening to the chaos that seemed to be erupting in the village below. "That's not the call to arms," Erik said, recognizing the horn pattern from his youth. "That's the signal for gathering. All adults to the meeting hall." Gunnar's calling for a formal vote, Magnus realized. He needs the community's official backing for whatever he's planning next. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the path below. But instead of armored mercenaries, a single figure climbed toward them, an elderly woman moving with the careful determination of someone for whom every step required effort, but whose will was unbreakable. "Ragnhild," Erik called out as he recognized the village's most respected weaver. "You shouldn't be here. It's dangerous." "Everything's dangerous these days," the old woman replied tartly as she reached Erik's threshold. "Especially standing by and watching good people get destroyed by bad decisions." Ragnhild was perhaps 70 winters old, her hair white as fresh snow, and her face mapped with lines that spoke of long experience with life's hardships and joys. But her eyes were sharp as a raven's, and her voice carried the authority of someone who'd outlived most of her critics and learned not to care about the rest. "You've caused quite a stir, young Erik," she said, settling gratefully on the stone bench outside his door. "Young Erik?" Astrid asked with amusement. "He's 50 winters old, and I'm 73, which makes him young from my perspective," Ragnhild replied with a cackle. "Besides, he's acting young, taking risks, fighting for love, defying authority. All the things young fools do when their hearts are engaged." Erik found himself smiling, despite the gravity of their situation. Ragnhild had been his mother's closest friend, one of the few people who'd continued to treat him as family, even during his years of isolation. "What news from the village?" he asked. "Bad and getting worse. Gunners called for a formal judgment, trial by combat if you refuse to surrender your family. He's claiming the right of challenge under the old laws." The words hit Erik like a physical blow. Trial by combat was an ancient tradition, rarely invoked, but still legally binding. It meant single combat between champions, with the gods supposedly guiding the outcome to ensure justice. In practice, it usually meant that whoever could afford the better fighter won their case. "Who's his champion?" Erik asked, though he suspected he already knew. Bloodaxe Ragnar, up from the southern settlements. They say he's never lost a formal challenge, and he's killed 17 men in sanctioned combat. Astrid went pale. "Erik, you can't." "I can and I will," Erik replied firmly. "It's the only way to end this without more bloodshed. If I win, Gunnar's authority is broken and our family is safe. If you lose, we all die anyway," Astrid finished. "At least this way, we have a chance." Ragnhild pulled a small cloth bundle from her traveling pack. "I brought something that might help." Inside the bundle lay a simple wooden cup carved from oak and polished smooth by generations of use. "This belonged to your father. He drank from it before every important decision, claimed it helped him think clearly." Erik accepted the cup with reverence. His father had been gone 20 years, but holding something he'd touched every day brought back memories of wisdom and strength that had shaped Erik's understanding of what leadership truly meant. "There's something else," Ragnhild continued. "The women have been talking, and we've made a decision. When this trial by combat happens, we'll all be watching. Every mother, every daughter, every wife in the village. Gunnar can try to hide behind legal traditions, but he can't escape the judgment of the women whose children he's threatened." As if summoned by her words, the sound of female voices drifted up from the valley, not the usual chatter of market day, but the organized murmur of women planning something significant. The sound sent chills down Erik's spine, not because he feared them, but because he recognized the power in their unity. "When?" he asked. 3 days hence, at dawn. The traditional time for divine judgment." Ragnhild struggled to her feet, her mission completed. "Be ready, Erik Thorsson. Not just your sword arm, but your heart. You're not just fighting for your family anymore, you're fighting for the soul of our community." As the old weaver made her careful way down the mountain path, Erik stood holding his father's cup and watching the smoke rise from the village below. In 3 days, everything would be decided. Either he would prove that love and justice could triumph over fear and tradition, or he would join Sigrid and Magnus in the ground behind his fortress. But as he looked at Astrid working patiently to repair the damaged runestone, her hands gentle but determined as she mixed clay and hope in equal measure, Erik felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, the absolute certainty that some things were worth dying for. The hidden letter lay wrapped in oiled leather at the bottom of Astrid's traveling pack, its parchment yellowed with age, but its words still sharp as winter wind. Magnus had found it while searching for clean swaddling cloth, and now it rested on Erik's table like an accusation waiting to be read. "Björn left this for me," Astrid said, her hands trembling as she unfolded the document. "He said to open it only if something happened to him, only if I needed proof of my true identity." Erik studied the careful script, recognizing the formal language of legal documents. But as his eyes moved across the lines, The implications of what he was reading struck him like hammer blows. I, Björn Eriksson, do hereby testify that the woman known to this village as Astrid the Widow is in truth Astrid Eriksdottir, lawful, daughter of Jarl Erik the Red of Kjalarnes and rightful heir to the northern territories under the ancient laws of succession, he read aloud. Magnus leaned forward, his scholarly training engaged. This changes everything. If Astrid is legitimate, heir to Kjalarnes, then my daughters are legitimate heirs after me, Astrid finished quietly. Not cursed bastards, but the next generation of a noble bloodline stretching back 7 generations. The weight of this revelation settled over them like fresh snow. Erik continued reading, his warrior's mind already calculating the political ramifications of each line. Furthermore, I do testify that the child or children she carries are not born of adultery or shame, but are the result of assault by Jarl Gunnar Thorsson, committed during the harvest feast in violation of all laws, sacred and secular. I have taken these children as my own to protect them and their mother from those who would use this crime for political advantage. Björn knew, Astrid said, tears streaming down her face. He knew everything, and he married me anyway, not out of pity, but because he understood that sometimes the greatest honor comes from protecting the innocent. Erik set the letter down carefully, his mind reeling with the implications. This wasn't just about village politics or traditional superstitions. This was about a conspiracy that reached back months, possibly years. Gunnar hadn't just condemned Astrid and her daughters out of religious fervor. He'd orchestrated an elaborate cover-up to hide his crimes and eliminate potential threats to his power. The timing of Björn's death, Erik said slowly. The convenient accident during a blizzard. Murder, Magnus said bluntly. It has to be. Björn was an experienced trader, knew these roads better than anyone. He wouldn't have been caught unprepared. By weather. Outside, the sounds of the village had changed. Instead of the usual evening quieting, there was commotion, voices raised in argument, the sound of many feet moving at once. Something was happening down there, something significant, enough to disrupt normal patterns. There's more, Astrid said, pointing to additional text on the reverse of the parchment. Björn documented other things, suspicious deaths, unexplained accidents, patterns of violence that all seemed to benefit Gunnar's consolidation of power. Erik scanned the additional testimony, his experienced eye recognizing the methodical approach of someone building a legal case. Björn hadn't just been protecting Astrid. He'd been gathering evidence of systematic corruption and abuse of power. Olaf's brother, Erik said, recognizing one of the names, the fisherman who supposedly fell from his boat during calm weather. He'd been asking questions about harbor taxes. And Ingvar the herder, Magnus added, found dead from wolf attack, but the wounds never looked quite right to those who examined the body. A sharp knock at the door interrupted their grim catalogue. Erik moved cautiously to answer, his axe within easy reach, but the voice that called out was familiar. "Erik, it's Ragnhild. I have news from the village. Urgent news." The old weaver entered quickly, her face flushed from hurried climbing and her eyes bright with excitement. "The trial by combat has been cancelled," she announced without preamble. "What? Why?" "Because half the village women marched to Gunnar's Hall tonight and demanded to hear the formal charges against you and your family." Ragnhild settled heavily on Erik's bench, catching her breath. When he tried to dismiss them, they refused to leave, just sat there in his hall, knitting and spinning, waiting for answers. Erik felt a surge of admiration for the village women. It was a brilliantly executed act of civil disobedience, impossible to ignore, but difficult to counter with violence without looking tyrannical. What happened then? Gunnar made the mistake of repeating his claims about adultery and cursed children. That's when Astrid's real identity came out. Astrid looked up sharply. "How?" Young Thora, the herb gatherer, recognized something you said about using willow bark for pain relief. Turns out she'd spent a summer in Kialanes learning from the healers. There, and she remembered your mother teaching that specific technique. Ragnhild's eyes twinkled with satisfaction. Once she spoke up, other memories started surfacing. Your way of speaking, certain skills you demonstrated, the quality of your needlework all pointed to noble training. Erik felt pieces falling into place like stones building a wall. The village women figured it out, more than figured it out. They started demanding answers. If Astrid was noble-born, why was she living as a trader's widow? If her children were legitimate heirs, why were they being condemned as cursed? Ragnhild leaned forward conspiratorially. That's when the whole story started unraveling. Magnus had been quiet during this recitation, but now he spoke with growing excitement. The women weren't just defending Astrid, they were conducting a formal investigation. Exactly. And what they found sent half the village into uproar. Björn's convenient death, the timing of accusations against Astrid, the pattern of suspicious accidents that had eliminated other potential rivals to Gunnar's authority. Ragnhild's voice grew grim. They put it together, Erik. They know what kind of man has been ruling them. Where does this leave us? Astrid asked. Divided village for now. Those loyal to Gunnar are calling the women's testimony gossip and superstition. But those with eyes to see understand. They've been living under a tyrant who murders to maintain power. Ragnhild stood up, preparing to leave. The trial by combat is cancelled, but only because Gunnar needs time to consolidate his remaining support. He'll be back, and when he comes, he'll bring everything he has. After the old woman left, the three adults sat in contemplative silence. The letter on Erik's table seemed to pulse with significance, not just evidence of past crimes, but a weapon that could bring down a corrupt ruler. We have to get this to the village, Magnus said finally. Let everyone read Björn's testimony, see the evidence with their own eyes. Gunnar won't let that happen, Erik replied. He'll do everything in his power to suppress this information. Then, we don't give him the choice, Astrid said, her voice carrying new strength. I am Astrid Eriksdottir, daughter of Jarls and heir to ancient rights. If Gunnar wants to contest my legitimacy, let him do it before the entire community, in broad daylight, with all the evidence laid bare. Erik looked at his wife with growing admiration. The frightened woman he'd found bleeding at his door had transformed into someone who could challenge the entire power structure of their community. Not through violence, but through the more dangerous weapon of truth. You're talking about calling for a formal assembly, he said, demanding justice under the old laws. I'm talking about reclaiming my birthright and protecting my daughter's future, Astrid replied firmly. Gunnar thought he could hide his crimes by killing witnesses and silencing victims. He underestimated the power of truth to surface eventually. Outside, the sounds from the village had changed again. Now there were torches moving in organized patterns, groups of people gathering at various houses. The community was choosing sides, and the battle lines were being drawn not around military positions, but around fundamental questions of justice and legitimacy. As Erik looked at Björn's letter and thought about the courage it must have taken to document such dangerous truths, he realized that tomorrow would bring not a trial by combat, but something potentially more decisive, a trial by community conscience. And in that kind of battle, the side with truth and justice might actually have a fighting chance. Erik's ancient war horn, carved from the tusk of a great walrus and decorated with silver inlay that caught the morning light, had not sounded across the valley for 15 years. Now, as he lifted it to his lips and drew breath deep from his chest, the instrument felt both familiar and strange, like greeting an old friend who had aged in unexpected ways. The first note rolled across the mountainside like thunder, deep and resonant and impossible to ignore. It echoed from the stone walls of the valley, reverberating through the village below, until every person within miles had stopped whatever they were doing to listen. The second note followed, then the third, building the ancient call to assembly that had summoned their ancestors to matters of life and death for generations beyond counting. "It is done," Erik said, lowering the horn. "By the old laws, the community must gather to hear testimony and render judgment. Gunnar cannot refuse without openly admitting he fears what the truth might reveal." Below them, the village was already stirring to life. People emerged from their houses, shading their eyes against the morning sun as they looked up toward Erik's mountain fortress. Even at this distance, he could sense their excitement and uncertainty. This was the first formal assembly called in decades, and many of the younger villagers had never witnessed such proceedings. Astrid stood beside him, her bearing transformed. From the broken woman he'd found at his door to someone who radiated quiet authority. She wore her best dress, the one she'd saved for special occasions during her marriage to Björn, and her hair was braided in the complex pattern that marked her noble heritage. In her arms, she held little Freydis, while Magnus carried Ingrid. Both twins seemed to sense the importance of the moment, remaining unusually calm and alert. "Are you ready for this?" Erik asked his wife. "I've been ready since the night they beat me and left me to die," Astrid replied, her voice steady with resolved determination. "Today, I reclaim not just my identity but my daughter's right to exist without shame or fear." Magnus adjusted his grip on Ingrid and straightened his priestly robes. "The church supports your claim, my lady. What was done to you and your children violates every law of God and man." From the village below, the sound of the assembly horn answered Erik's call. 3 short blasts that acknowledged the summons and confirmed that the gathering would convene at the traditional time and place. In 2 hours, when the sun reached its zenith, the entire community would come together in the ancient stone circle that had served their ancestors as a place of judgment for over a century. The battle standard Erik unfurled in the center of the assembly circle was unlike any banner the village had seen before. Woven by Astrid's own hands during the long nights of their siege, it combined the symbols of both their bloodlines. Erik's raven of war intertwined with the golden wolf of Astrid's father's house. The fabric caught the wind and snapped proudly, a declaration that this was no longer about tradition versus defiance, but about the birth of something entirely new. "I call upon the ancient laws," Astrid announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the stone circle. "I am Astrid Eriksdottir, daughter of Jarl Erik the Red, and I claim the right to speak truth before this assembly." Gunnar's face flushed red with rage. "This is meaningless theater. The woman is a condemned adulteress whose cursed offspring, whose daughters are your own flesh and blood," Astrid interrupted, her words cutting through his bluster like a blade. "Born of your violence against an innocent woman during the harvest feast." A shocked murmur ran through the assembly. Even those who had heard rumors seemed stunned by the directness of the accusation. Gunnar's supporters shifted uncomfortably, while his opponents leaned forward with sudden interest. "Lies," Gunnar snarled, but his voice carried less conviction than before. "Desperate fabrications from a woman facing justice." Magnus stepped forward, carrying Björn's letter. "Then let us examine the evidence with clear eyes and honest hearts." He began to read aloud the trader's careful documentation, his voice steady and clear in the mountain air. As the testimony unfolded, the forced assault, the political marriage to protect Astrid, the systematic elimination of potential rivals to Gunnar's power, the mood of the assembly began to shift. The detailed accounts were too specific to be invented, too consistent with observed facts to be dismissed as gossip. Ragnhild rose from her place among the women. "I remember that harvest feast," she announced. "I remember Astrid disappearing. And for a time, and returning with torn clothing and fear in her eyes, I remember thinking someone should ask what had happened, and then deciding it was not my concern. Her voice grew stronger. I have spent every day since regretting that cowardice. One by one, other witnesses began to speak. Village women who had noticed Astrid's distress. Men who had observed Gunnar's increasingly violent responses to any challenge to his authority. Traders who could testify to the suspicious circumstances surrounding several convenient deaths. "Enough of this charade," Gunnar shouted, rising to his feet with his hand on his sword. "I will not stand here and listen to the ravings of malcontents and troublemakers." "Then you admit the truth of the accusations," Erik said quietly, but his words carried to every ear in the circle. "An innocent man welcomes investigation. Only the guilty flee from it." Gunnar's eyes blazed with fury as he turned on Erik. "You think your reputation protects you, hermit? You think these sheep care about your past glories?" He gestured to the mercenaries positioned around the circle. "I have real power. I have men willing to shed blood for gold. And I have something more valuable," Erik replied, his hand moving to rest on his sword hilt. "I have people willing to shed blood for justice." The tension in the circle became palpable. This was the moment everyone had feared and expected, the point where words would give way to violence, where the assembly would dissolve into chaos and bloodshed. But before anyone could draw steel, an unexpected voice cut through the confrontation. "I have something to say." All eyes turned to see Blood Axe Ragnar, the professional champion Gunnar had brought in for the original trial by combat. The legendary fighter stepped forward, his scarred face thoughtful as he studied the assembled villagers. "I've listened to the testimony," he said slowly. "I've heard the evidence. I've watched how this community has torn itself apart over questions that should have simple answers." He turned to face Gunnar directly. "You hired me to fight for your cause, but you never told me your cause involved murdering innocent children." "They are not innocent," Gunnar protested. "They are cursed." "They are babies," Ragnar interrupted, "and I have never killed a child, nor will I fight to defend someone who orders their deaths." He unbuckled his sword belt and let it fall to the ground. "Find yourself another champion, Jarl. My honor is not for sale at any price." The mercenaries' defection sent shockwaves through both sides of the conflict. Gunnar's remaining supporters looked uncertain, while Erik's allies seemed emboldened by this unexpected ally. But Gunnar himself seemed to grow more desperate rather than less dangerous. Erik recognized the look in the man's eyes. The cornered fury of someone who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. "If I cannot rule through law," Gunnar snarled, drawing his sword, "then I will rule through fear. Kill them all, the woman, the children, and anyone who stands with them." The mercenaries hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with orders that went far beyond their original contract. But several of Gunnar's most loyal followers drew their weapons, and suddenly the sacred assembly circle became a battlefield where the future of their community would be decided by steel and blood. Gunnar's ceremonial crown, an ancient circlet of silver and iron that had marked leadership in their village for 7 generations, lay shattered among the scattered stones of the assembly circle, its authority broken as completely as the man who had worn it. The battle had been brief, but decisive. When Gunnar ordered his followers to attack civilians in the sacred circle, even his most loyal supporters hesitated. That moment of uncertainty was all Erik needed. The legendary warrior's blade sang through the morning air with the precision of decades of combat experience, but this was not the wild fury of a berserker. This was the controlled violence of a protector, each stroke calculated to disable rather than kill, each movement designed to minimize harm to innocent bystanders while maximum efficiency against genuine threats. Olaf fought beside him with the methodical skill of a craftsman, his hammer wielding as deadly as any sword. Magnus, despite his priestly vows, proved surprisingly effective at organizing the defense of the non-combatants, while Astrid coordinated the evacuation of children and elderly villagers from the immediate combat zone. But it was the community itself that truly won the battle. When Gunnar's remaining mercenaries saw village women armed with kitchen knives standing shoulder to shoulder with farmers carrying scythes, when they realized they were fighting not just Erik Thorsson, but an entire population in revolt, their professional instincts took over. Mercenaries were paid to win battles, not to die in hopeless causes. The end came when Erik cornered Gunnar near the central stone of the circle. The corrupt Jarl fought with the desperation of a man who knew defeat meant more than just political loss. It meant answering for years of hidden crimes and accumulated injustices. "You could have been a good leader," Erik said, as their swords locked together, his voice carrying genuine sadness. "Your father was. The village respected your family, trusted your judgment. Why wasn't that enough?" "Because respect can be lost," Gunnar snarled, pressing against Erik's blade with the strength of desperation. "Fear is more reliable. Fear doesn't ask uncomfortable questions or challenge difficult decisions. Fear also doesn't inspire loyalty," Erik replied, using his superior skill to turn Gunnar's attack aside. "As you're learning today, the final exchange lasted only moments. Gunnar, exhausted by his own fury and weakened by the gradual desertion of his supporters, made a wild lunge that left him off balance and vulnerable. Erik's counterstroke was precise and merciful, thrust that pierced the heart cleanly, ending Gunnar's reign without unnecessary suffering. As the corrupt Jarl fell beside his broken crown, a profound silence settled over the assembly circle. The violence that had threatened to consume their community was over, but the work of rebuilding what had been destroyed was just beginning. "It is finished," Magnus announced, his priestly authority lending weight to the declaration. "Let no one say that justice was not served this day." But Erik felt no satisfaction in victory, only the weary sadness that came with necessary violence. "There are no winners when communities tear themselves apart," he said quietly. "Only survivors who must find ways to heal the wounds." Astrid approached, carrying both twins, her noble bearing unmarked by the chaos around them. "The children are safe," she reported. "All the children. Whatever else we've lost today, we've protected the innocent." Bloodaxe Ragnar knelt beside Gunnar's body, his professional eye assessing the wound that had ended the conflict. "Clean death," he observed approvingly. "No unnecessary cruelty. Your reputation for honor was well earned, Erik Thorsson." Around them, the community was slowly emerging from the shock of violence and beginning to process what their victory actually meant. Gunnar's supporters were laying down their weapons and awaiting judgment, while Erik's allies began the practical work of tending wounds and restoring order. "What happens now?" asked Thorvald, the young man whose change of allegiance had symbolized the community's transformation. Erik looked around the assembly circle, taking in the faces of people who had risked everything to stand up for justice. "Now we learn to govern ourselves through law and conscience rather than fear and tradition. We build something worthy of the price we paid for it." Ragnhild approached, carrying the shattered pieces of Gunnar's crown. "This has ruled our village for 7 generations, she said thoughtfully. "Perhaps it's time for something new." "Not a crown at all," Astrid suggested, "but a council where decisions are made by many voices rather than one will." Erik nodded approvingly. "Leadership should be earned through service, not inherited through bloodline or claimed through violence." As the sun reached its afternoon zenith, the assembly circle became a place of planning rather than combat. The community that had nearly destroyed itself in conflict began the slow work of rebuilding trust and establishing new traditions based on justice rather than fear. The battle was won, But the war for the soul of their village was just beginning. And in the center of it all, two baby girls slept peacefully in their mother's arms, unaware that they had become the catalyst for their community's transformation from tyranny to hope. The family portrait stone Erik carved that spring was unlike any memorial their village had ever seen. Instead of the traditional solemn figures facing forward in rigid poses, this stone showed a family at play. Erik lifting a laughing toddler while Astrid held her sister, all of them surrounded by symbols of life rather than death. The inscription read simply, "Here lived the Thorssons, Erik, Astrid, Freydis and Ingrid, who chose love over fear." 2 years had passed since the assembly that transformed their community, and the changes went far deeper than anyone had expected. The village council now met in the open air rather than behind closed doors, with any citizen free to observe and speak. Laws were written down and posted publicly rather than existing as the private interpretation of whoever held power. Most importantly, children were valued for their potential rather than condemned for circumstances beyond their control. "They're walking already," Astrid observed with maternal pride as she watched the twins toddle around the village square, their confident steps carrying them toward other children who welcomed them without question or fear. Erik smiled as he watched Freydis attempt to climb onto the fountain while Ingrid investigated a merchant's colorful wares. Walking, talking, and getting into everything they can reach, completely normal children despite all the dire predictions. The spring market was in full swing around them, but it bore little resemblance to the tense, fearful gatherings of gunners. Merchants called out their wares with genuine enthusiasm, children played freely between the stalls, and the overall atmosphere was one of community celebration rather than mere commercial exchange. Magnus, no longer the younger since, assuming full priestly duties, approached with a group of visitors from neighboring settlements. Word of their village's transformation had spread, and delegations regularly arrived seeking to understand how they had managed to transition from tyranny to self-governance without descending into chaos. "The delegation from Vestfjord wants to know about your legal reforms," Magnus reported, "specifically how you established property rights for women and inheritance rights for all children regardless of birth circumstances. Tell them it started with recognizing that justice means protecting the vulnerable, not abandoning them," Astrid replied, scooping up Ingrid as the curious toddler attempted to investigate a blacksmith's forge. "Once you accept that principle, the specific laws follow naturally." Olaf emerged from his smithy, wiping his hands on his leather apron. The past 2 years had been good to the giant blacksmith. His workshop was busier than ever, producing not just weapons and tools, but also the decorative ironwork that marked their village's growing prosperity. "The new apprentices are working out well," he reported. "Young Thorvald has real talent, and the others are learning fast. We'll have enough skilled smiths to handle all the trade requests within another year." Erik nodded approvingly. One of their first reforms had been establishing proper apprenticeship programs, ensuring that valuable skills would be passed down to the next generation rather than hoarded by guild masters. The result was a burst of innovation and productivity that had surprised even the reformers themselves. Ragnhild approached carrying a beautifully woven baby blanket, her face creased with the special smile she reserved for important announcements. "For little Erik," she said, presenting the blanket to a young woman Erik didn't immediately recognize. "Erik?" Astrid asked, raising an eyebrow. The young woman blushed slightly. "My husband and I wanted to honor the man who taught us that protecting children is the most important work adults can do. We hope our son grows up to be half as brave and wise." It was a conversation they'd had many times over the past 2 years. Children born in their village were increasingly given names that honored the values of their new community: courage, wisdom, justice, and compassion. The next generation would grow up with different expectations about leadership and responsibility. As the afternoon wore on and the market began to wind down, Erik found himself standing beside the repaired rune stone in the small cemetery behind his mountain home. The memorial to Sigrid and Magnus was now part of a larger installation that honored all those who had died during the village's troubled years. Victims of Gunnar's cruelty, soldiers who had fallen in the Assembly Circle battle, and even Gunnar himself, whose stone carried the inscription, "Lost to fear what love might have redeemed." "Do you think they would approve?" Astrid asked, joining him with the twins playing at their feet. Erik was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "Seriously, Sigrid would have loved you," he said finally. "She always believed that love multiplied when shared, rather than diminishing. And Magnus would have adored his little sisters. He always wanted siblings." Freydis chose that moment to discover an interesting beetle, prompting a detailed toddler explanation of its various fascinating properties. Ingrid countered with her own discovery, a flower she immediately tried to share with everyone present, including the beetle. "They're going to change the world," Astrid said with certainty. "They already have," Erik replied. "The moment they were born, they started a chain of events that transformed an entire community. By the time they're grown, they'll live in a world that values justice over tradition, compassion over fear." As the sun set behind the mountains and painted the village below in shades of gold and amber, Erik reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, he'd been a broken hermit hiding from life's pain. Now he was a husband, father, and community leader who'd learned that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. The twins' laughter echoed across the mountainside as they chased fireflies in the gathering dusk, their joy a perfect counterpoint to the peaceful sounds rising from the village below. In that laughter, Erik heard the sound of hope made real, proof that even the darkest nights could give way to bright mornings when people chose to stand together against fear and embrace the harder path of love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as all tomorrows did. But tonight, as his family gathered around their table and shared the evening meal from their worn wooden bowl, Erik Thorsson was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by the people he loved most, in a community that had chosen justice over convenience and hope over fear. The story carved on their family stone would endure long after they were gone, a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through conquest, but through the simple act of choosing to protect those who cannot protect themselves.